in the salt flat wastes felt thirsty, leaching the moisture from a man's lungs with every breath. Commander Valen pulled his scarf tighter against the biting, crystalline dust. His command was in tatters. 35 men had marched south from Asura a month ago, their expedition funded by a wealthy patron named Malcroft. Now, only 8 remained, their eyes hollow with a fear that went deeper than the thirst or fatigue. Raiders had ambushed them in the borderlands, destroying most of their strength. Valen himself had almost been run down by a steppe rider when a sword blow, meant for his head, instead landed on the shoulder of the man next to him. The force of the swing had knocked the man off his feet and into Valen, pushing them both onto the ground. How the wounded man had screamed. Valen remembered falling to the ground, the dirt filling his vision, dust in his lungs making him choke. He had thought then that the expedition was over, before they had even made it out of the heartland. What a tremendous failure. As such, when he looked up to see the flanks of the horses running away, their riders retreating, he had been surprised. It had been Shusett, one of the archers. She had loosed a lucky shot that had knocked the helm off the head raider, making him sound the retreat in panic. Valen had made the difficult decision to leave their wounded, and they had force-marched for the southern gap, the raiders following closely, the dust of their horses visible on the horizon behind them. They had pushed without sleep for 2 days, only to be stopped when one of the cart's wheel shafts had busted. He remembered how much it pained him to abandon most of their supplies. They had reorganized, unhitching the horses and loading them up with the bare necessities, then they had rode on, lighter for the sacrifice. It was then that the pursuit had stopped. Whether because the bandits had accepted the spoils and abandoned the effort, or they had entered the territory of another steppe tribe, Valen could not say. Nor did he care, glad for the relief. He had called a rest in the nook of a hill. In the cold night of the foothills of the Fang Mountains, not daring to light a fire, they had all piled together for warmth. No other tribe had pursued them past the southern gap. Valen knew that it was thanks to their lighter arrangement and the unusual destination. Not many merchants had business in the salt flats, and rich caravans did not travel light. Tribes knew better than to waste time pursuing small groups. Once at the Wall Mountains, they had followed a dried creek bed up the line of the hills, the path guiding them ever west and higher. The air had grown thin and cold when they had finally risked a fire. Their food store was fair, but the water-skins were growing light. The highlands had yet to enter the full might of the winter, so far south, and what little snowpack had been exhausted by the summer. It was on the 2nd day of their descent into the salt flats that their water finally ran dry, and it was on the 4th day when they had slaughtered a horse for its blood, desperate for any fluid. It had been a mistake. 2 of his troops had vomited up the blood, along with their own bile. Parched and burned, they were unable to keep up. Valen had left them behind, a gift to the ever-present vultures circling above. Shusett had been one of them. On the 5th day, they ran upon a creek that still carried a trickle of water, disappearing south towards the plains. The water was bitter and brown, yet to them, it had been the best they had ever tasted. They left their horses and filled their waterskins, turning south for the final leg of the journey. It had been 3 days now since they had left their horses behind. A wind was battering them relentlessly as they walked. The dust in the air was significantly reducing visibility. Suddenly, their lead guide, an intense scholar priest named Quent, pointed a trembling finger towards a jagged fissure in the earth. There, the ossuary, the great stillness awaits its heralds. Beside him, his junior acolyte, a young, fervent man named Phelan, watched with rapt attention, his fingers nervously tracing the hem of his robe. As they descended into the fissure, the howling desert wind vanished, replaced by a silence so complete it felt like a physical pressure on the eardrums. Stillness was not the word Valen would have chosen. Absence was closer. As they continued deeper, Valen noticed that there were ruins all around them, great arches and pillars sculpted from the salt rock itself. The structures were beginning to crowd them from all sides, channeling them deeper into the fissure, as if they were on an ancient, broad roadway, paved into the bedrock itself. As the orange haze of the sun was masked by the cliffs, they arrived. An impossibly precise rectangular wall, carved out of the bedrock ahead. It had a single door opening out to a massive set of stairs, designed as if for a giant. They ascended the stairs and entered through the door, Quent guiding them with a feverish certainty. Valen and his men were in complete awe of the scale of the structure. The door had opened up to a massive hallway with impossibly high ceilings, emanating a surreal light. Ahead, the hallway split into two. On the left was a massive chamber with rows of pews rising from the floor into seamless benches. The ceiling was made up of vaulted salt crystals gleaming with their own light. The chamber's acoustics were such that, when Quen approached the altar, Valen could hear not only the priest's shaky breath, but even the man's heartbeat, deep and fast, steadily thumping against the eardrums. Satisfied with the empty auditorium, Quent led them back to the hallway, then down the passage on right, where the air grew cooler and all light disappeared. They had brought kindling with them, yet when they lit their torches, the light of their fire was consumed by the dark and failed to illuminate even their own feet. Despite the lack of sight, Quent continued to push on, leading them ever deeper. When the uneasiness in Valen's heart grew so unbearable that he was ready to call off the descent, they came upon an entry through a carved archway into the lower chamber. Inside, the chamber was a perfect negative of the one above. Where that one was grand and vaulted, this was intimate and womb-like, its walls smooth and curved. Apophyted limestone flags, each etched with a single repeating spiral, led to a central platform. The chamber was an intricate work of art. Small animals and plants were carved masterfully out of the bedrock walls. The details were so fine that Valen could make out the fur on a lion's mane and a flower rising out of a bush, its tiny petals wet with dew. But it was not the artistry that stole their breath. It was what waited for them at the center of the chamber. There at the center was the altar, a mound of crystalline salt that had been sculpted in a way that looked grown into a twisted, thorn-like formation, shaped like a rectangular box. And cradled above the box hung a rift, a vertical tier in reality that shimmered like a heat haze, revealing glimpses of a gray, formless beyond. "It's beautiful," Quent whispered, his voice a sacrilege in the perfect quiet. He took a step forward, his eyes glazing over. "So peaceful. Stand fast." Valen barked, but the man didn't seem to hear. As Quent stepped onto the inscribed floor before the altar, a gray tentacle-like appendage licked out from the suspended rift. It passed through him, and the man simply stopped. All expression, all thought was wiped clean. A gray pallor spread across his skin. Then a wisp of silver light, his essence, his soul, was torn from his chest and drawn into the gray void beyond, feeding whatever hid beyond. What was left of him? His body was rigid, his face a mask, his mouth open but wordless. More gray tentacles reached from the rift, this time corporeal, wrapping about his chest, lifting him into the air and creating a cocoon about him. Grayness bled into the air of the chamber itself, clinging to the walls. Panic erupted. Men turned to flee, but the silence seemed too thick, a tangible web. A soldier, backing away, brushed against the Sultan wall of the chamber. The same gray pallor seized him, leeching his life away to feed the rift. The cocoon about what was once Quen thickened, beginning to glow, beginning to emanate power, threatening to absorb them all, to absorb the world. "Don't touch anything, retreat!" Valen roared, his discipline shattering. He grabbed the nearest person, the young acolyte Phelan, who was watching the horrific ritual with a devastating, profound awe, and shoved him back towards the entrance. They fled, the ossuary consuming 2 more men before they scrambled back out of the valley and into the blinding sun, the howling wind a welcome cacophony. The journey back was a phantom march. 4 men had left the fissure, down to 3 when they reached the bitter creek. It was only him and Phelan left when they found one of their abandoned horses wandering in the Wall Mountains, the saddle still packed with food and firewood. 3 weeks after leaving the ossuary, the 2 survivors finally stumbled into a garrison fort near the Southern Gap, more dead than alive, their story a babbling, incoherent thing of whispers and gray light. They were given water, pallets, and wary, distant looks. The young acolyte said nothing, his gaze turned inward, fingers tracing the hem of his robe over and over. 2 weeks later, Valen stood in a lavish study, the memory of the desert a fresh scar on his soul. Across a desk of polished darkwood sat Marius Malcroft, the expedition's patron. "A total loss," Valen reported, his voice hollow. "On the contrary, Commander," a new voice cut in. Phelan stepped from the shadows. He was no longer the quiet acolyte. The ordeal had transformed his bearing, giving him a slimy confidence and a deeply unpleasant gaze. "It was a revelation. You witnessed the future, a state of perfect order, free from the chaotic noise of life. What you call loss, I call ascension." "It was a death trap," Valen spat, his pride in tatters. "A tomb. There was nothing there to recover but madness." It is a tool, Phelan corrected, his voice soft but ironclad. A tool to silence the chaotic world and shape it into something pure. The stillness doesn't destroy, it preserves, it shows us the way. No artifacts, no relics, just a void. Malcroft cut in, his voice oddly calm. He steepled his fingers. You've cost me too much, both of you. A manic smile was spreading across Malcroft's lean face now. It froze Valen's blood. Then, in a quiet voice, he said, I will make you pay. Weeks later, standing before his superiors, Valen was officially broken. His expedition was a catastrophic failure. His reputation was ash. He was exiled to a backwater outpost of the Trades Alliance called Silver Hill. He had no idea what became of the Acolyte, but he imagined their faith wasn't much different from his. When he arrived at his new keep, his mind still reeled with the images of the ossuary. As he looked out over the peaceful, ignorant whisperwood from the walls, his shame curdled into a bitter resolve.